of folks. Now, consequence for that, I think, needs to be drawn for the nature and character of contemporary state and the character of public life. Continued vibrancy and political assertiveness of religion, that's one of my assumptions. Now, the second assumption is acceptance of equality and fairness as fundamental social values. Now, you'll notice that my argument will not be from social utility of religion. It will also not be from the fact that I consider religion to be somehow the good for society. It's actually based on fairness. It's based on rights. We can make the other argument as well, but my argument for tonight is the argument for rights of individuals rather than from the good of religion. Now, if that's true, if my two assumptions are true, even actually if the first assumption, which is increased growth of religion, vitality and assertiveness, even if that assumption weren't right, my still argument would hold true, but it holds true even more, or it's more important, if it's true that religions continue to be vibrant and politically assertive. As a consequence, I think the state should neither be religious nor it should be secular, but it should be neutral. And more precisely, I think it should be impartial toward all overarching interpretations of life. Not supporting one, if not supporting one, not supporting any. If promoting one, promoting equally all. Now, when I put it this way, of course, you will immediately say, and I will concur with you, that the devil is in the details, right? It's not so much that this vision isn't compelling, and many people find it, I think, compelling. The challenge will be, how do you implement it in highly pluralistic societies? How do you make the decisions of what means then equality for all religions? How do you not then have some kind of a secular space, but actually you have an equal representation of all religions, what that means. So one thing, state is impartial. Second, each citizen should have equal voice in public affairs. Equal voice in that citizen's own terminology, in their own ways of presenting things, rather than needing to see some kind of public reason to mediate what they, on other reasons, believe. Now, the religious folks might not be particularly smart to give biblical reasons in public realm because they may not find the hearing for those reasons, but in principle they should be allowed to bring any reasons that they consider to be compelling to them. So, what I'm advocating here is that suppressing religious voices from public life is a mode of injustice. It's a mode of oppression. It's a mode of trampling on people's rights. Suppressing secular, religious, and also certain forms of secular voices, I think undermines, in fact, democracy. Not just because it tramples on rights, but it also because it presses alternative into underground and therefore makes them much more dangerous for democracy itself. So I'm advocating here is something like what I've called elsewhere faith-friendly democracy. Or, I would rather put it this way, a democracy that is friendly both to religions and to varieties of our religion. And I say faith-friendly, not faith-based, and I say pluralistic rather than exclusivistic. Now, in varieties of settings, this kind of vision would have to be applied concretely because each of the particular settings has its own historical legacy that needs to be respected. But roughly, I think that is the direction in which we ought to move. Now, let's assume that I'm right. Now, I know that some of you, that might be a big assumption, but let's assume for a moment that I'm right. We should strive to recast political order to be more pluralistic and therefore also more faith-friendly. Now, you might ask, well, what about faiths themselves? Can faiths themselves be friendly to democracy? Aren't they authoritarian? Or, I think, more fundamental question, can they be friendly to pluralistic democracy? Aren't faiths exclusivistic? And in fact, secular exclusion of religion from public life rests in part on the conviction that religion is inherently intolerant and that is inherently not pluralistic. So my next section is faith and pluralistic democracy, or faiths and pluralistic democracy. And I'll ask the question, are faiths democracy friendly? And are faiths friendly to pluralistic democracy? So are they democracy friendly? Now, one of the most extraordinary developments of the 20th century is the spread of democracy, the most powerful, energizing idea of the 20th century, as Anthony Giddens has called it. The democratic ideal has conquered the world. And interestingly enough, by far, the most adherents of world religions embrace democracy. Now, that may be a surprise to some, and in some ways it's easy to see why it would be a surprise, because for long stretches of their history, religions have not embraced democracy. And especially if you look at monotheism, what you had is prevalence of one possibility of how monotheism relates to political order. One God was seen to justify and underwrite the rule of the one ruler. So to say, God and ruler were on one side, and they stood as opposed in opposition or in contrast to all the people. But it's possible to think of the relationship between God, one, and many in a different way. And indeed, at the very origins, say, of Israel's search for the king, you have this debate between Samuel and the Israelite people, and kind of God mixes himself into this debate. Israelites want the king, and Samuel, God says to Samuel, they have abandoned me. God sees a contrast between king and himself because there's a direct relationship between God and people. Here, then, you don't have God, one, and all. You have it the other way around, God, all, and then possibly one or many, whoever ruled then as delegated from the people. So this other possibility, I think, is very much alive, and it's not just kind of made up from the beginning. It was present there. Now, since world religions, it's true of Christianity, it's true of other world religions as well, since they always address human beings as individuals and confront them with what they claim to be truth about human existence, religions, just for that reason, place responsibility for the kind of life a person will lead into that person's own hands. This is the bedrock idea, I think, of democracy. Now, some of you might say, well, aren't there really exceptions to this? And often people cite Islam as an exception to this. But also there are very important strands in Islam which take the central creed of Islam, no God but God, as precisely implying direct rule of God over people unmediated by political authorities. Indeed, representative of Muslim Brotherhood, Said Qutb, does precisely that. But interestingly also enough, and in line with this thinking, majority of Muslims in the world prefer democracy over a strong leader. There's one exception, one regional exception, and that's South Asia, where 45% do. But otherwise, great majority of Muslims prefer democracy over a strong leader, and overwhelming majority embrace religious freedom. Say 85% of Muslims in Middle East to about 97% of them in North Africa. So it seems clear that religions are democracy friendly. Now, one of the central questions is, are religions also friendly to pluralistic democracy? And here the answer is not so clear. I want to make argument that they are, but that argument is somewhat harder to make than for the fact that religions are democracy friendly. Now, many religious people are not friendly to pluralistic democracy, and historically they have not been. To stay with the example of Islam, high percentage of world Muslims favor making Islamic law, Sharia, the official law of their country. Now that's not particularly pluralistic. Even if it's true that half think that it should apply to all, only half think that it should apply to all citizens rather than to Muslims alone. And you've got similar sentiments among other religions as well. You have to keep in mind that in the Roman Catholic Church, in the official teaching, it's only in the 60s that the idea of religious freedom has actually been embraced. So faiths are happy to embrace democracy, but they embrace an exclusivistic form of democracy where people have sovereignty, but within a single overarching interpretation of life. So why do religious people do that? Well, because how could we think of faith as wrong and the way of life that it advocates as harmful, while at the same time believing that it's good to allow it to flourish? You kind of have to curtail that. It's a weed that has to be kind of taken away so that the good plants can grow. Or sometimes religious people would affirm freedom of religion for themselves, but would deny it for others. And that's kind of discrepancy in kind of self-interested discrepancy in their position. But if faith is a free act of a person, if faith is not simply conformity to beliefs and practices, then it requires ascription of responsibility to the person for the character and for trajectory of their lives. And this kind of anthropological condition of possibility, if you want to put it this way, of religious claim upon our life. Each religion world religion makes a claim upon individual life. For a religion to be able to make that claim, it has to be the case that it assumes that I have responsibility for my life. And this affirmation of the responsibility for my life, for trajectory of my life, is a foundational stone for embrace also of pluralistic democracy. So to be consistent, world religions must embrace freedom of religion for all, freedom to embrace religion, and freedom also to reject it. Now, therefore, religions are capable, I say, of embracing pluralism as a political project. Now, there's one significant obstacle. It's a major obstacle. And see whether we can figure out how to negotiate our way through that. Most adherents of world religions are not just political exclusivists, they're also religious exclusivists, and primarily they're also religious exclusivists, which is to say that they think that their faith is the true faith, and although they may not deny that there is truth in other faiths, they still believe that theirs is the true faith, and they judge other faiths in the light of the truth of their own faith. Now, question is, are religious exclusivists necessarily also political exclusivists? Some people argue that that's exactly the case. The fierce version of it, religious exclusivists will be political exclusivists which advocate some kind of totalitarianism, saturation of public space with their own religion. Or they can be have a little bit of softer version of that and advocate strong authoritarianism. For a while I was teaching a course at Yale entitled Faiths and Globalization. And every single time I taught that course, on very first session of that course, one student would raise their hand, and first time I taught it, it was the first question that was ever raised in that course, was exactly about this. Most religious people are religious exclusivists. How can religious exclusivists be advocates of political pluralism? And one of the students who raised that question had in his question, he was a religious person himself, and in his question you could detect the echoes of Rousseau's social contract. And toward the end of Rousseau's social contract, some of you who know the text will recall that he raises precisely this question. Let me read what he says. Those who distinguish civil intolerance, let's say social political intolerance, or in my terms, exclusivism, From theological intolerance or religious exclusivism, those who distinguish civil intolerance from theological intolerance are, in my opinion, mistaken. These two kinds of intolerance are inseparable. It is impossible to live in peace with people whom we believe to be damned. To love them would be to hate God who punishes them. It is absolutely necessary to reclaim them or to punish them. Wherever theological intolerance is allowed, it cannot but have some effect in civil life, and as soon as it has any, the sovereign is no longer sovereign even in secular affairs. From that time, the priests are the real masters, the kings are their officers. You let religious exclusivity into the house of common life, and that's like camel's nose in your tent. You are gone in no time. Religion is going to swallow you and pull your house down. Now, many secularists and also many religious people believe just like that. But are they right? Is affirmation of freedom of religion and freedom of a way of life described by religion, is this just kind of a modern idea of recent origin with no roots in religion itself? Is religious pluralism, is political pluralism simply a modern idea that religious people have to kind of adjust themselves against the grain of their own better judgments? Now, I think the best way to answer this question is to look in history and, in fact, to look at the origins of political pluralism. And I haven't traced the roots all the way back. It's a complex story. But one person is certainly close to the origin of Western forms of political pluralism. And this is a guy of whom probably you've never heard. His name is Thomas Helvez. He lived at the tail end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, and he wrote a book with the title, A Short Declaration of the Mystery of Iniquity. It's not a friendly title, right? There's your religious exclusivist already in the title. He's telling you what's going to happen here. But listen what he says. What is this mystery of iniquity? The king is a mortal man and not God. Therefore, he has no power over the immortal souls of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them, to set spiritual lords over them. Atheists, pagans, Jews, Muslims, all have, according to Thomas Helvez, equal rights. The thesis was revolutionary because he said each immortal soul, whether of a heretical Christian or a Jew or Muslim or an atheist, is free from the state's interference with regard to its faith. Now, he wrote that book in Amsterdam, traveled to London, published it there, and then sent it to the king. And the king promptly put him to jail. And it's in jail that he died also. But not before Roger Williams have taken note of him. And Roger Williams, between his work and where he lived, he had to pass by that prison. And the theory is that he knew of Thomas Helvez in prison and that he knew of the book. And it's to Roger Williams that we actually owe the first institutionalization of political pluralism in the Western societies, which is a state of Rhode Island in the United States. Both of these folks were fierce religious exclusivists. And just because they had strong Christian convictions, just because of that, they were also political pluralists. So strong religious exclusivists are can be and have been at the very origin of political pluralism. Now, secular humanists have also contested political pluralism. Secular exclusivists, right? We have many examples. That kind of secular exclusivism also pushes against the notion of political pluralism. And so in conclusion, what I wanted to say is that religious people and secular humanists, we don't have problem with democracy, but we both have problem with pluralistic democracy. Religious political exclusivism and secular political exclusivism mirror each other and condition each other, as I've suggested at the beginning of the lecture. The challenge, I think, of our time, in which multiple overarching interpretations of life exist under the same political roof, is to find a way to embrace just such democratic pluralism. Adherents of world faiths have internal resources to embrace democratic pluralism, even when they advocate exclusivist forms of religiosity, or so I have argued in this lecture. Now, maybe it would take another lecture, and maybe it is a completely obvious thing, that secular humanists have resources to embrace democratic, pluralistic democracy. There are folks, serious philosophers, who doubt that, because they doubt that secular humanism has sufficient philosophical resources to justify human rights. But I leave that aside and assume that embrace of political pluralism is possible. So challenge is to articulate compelling local political visions and establish and maintain political institutions which will be truly pluralistic, giving equal voice to each citizen, no matter what their religious persuasion or our religious persuasion, maintain impartiality of the state toward all overarching interpretations of life, and create hospitable public spaces and institutions in which all citizens, diverse citizens, religious and irreligious, would feel at home. Thank you very much.
While the questions come in, we already have a few good ones. I want to ask you about the Yale program that I've heard you mention before, where you study the truth claims of the Buddha, Jesus, Nietzsche, and allow students to really be confronted with their claims as truth claims on our life. Can you tell us a little more about that? Because it's a fascinating example in the academic world of what you're talking about.
Yeah, you may think of, say, Yale, and sometimes Yale, we at Yale think of ourselves as secular university. Again, I tend to think of Yale as a pluralistic university, and in such university you may think that kind of normative claims of religions may be kind of pushed aside. I find that not to be the case, and especially at Yale there's a long tradition of thinking and engaging truth claims of alternative worldviews. And what I do in this course is basically, in a sense, it's a way to train us, or citizenry, or students, to reflect and deliberate about religions as if, or precisely as once, they do make truth claims. Generally what happens about religions, you don't talk about religion, or you presume that religion is simply your preference. This is kind of what you've decided to do, and that's okay. And you like certain kind of food, I like certain other kind of food, and we're okay if we disagree on foods, but it's a matter of your taste rather than a matter of claims to truth that it has on you. Now, I think when that happens in the public debate, obviously something very significant gets lost. Because you can't adjudicate taste if tastes clash. Then you only have to either vote against them, right? Or you have to fight. There's no other option. But if religions make actually truth claims, then there is an ability and possibility that we can engage those, learn something from each other, kind of adjust our perspectives, enrich our own understanding of that truth. So my sense is that what we are doing there in this course is actually training people for responsible citizenship and for something like hoped for deliberative democracy. I know that many other things stand in way of deliberative democracy, but certainly seeing religions as simply expressions of our taste is one of those things.
A very interesting question about our Bible, our First Fleet Bible here. Someone has written in, do you think that the Bible you are sharing the stage with could rightly be perceived as a symbol of Christianity's implication in colonialism? Is this not inappropriate in the context of a conference on Christianity in the public square?
Well, it's not just the Bible that's implicated in Christianity's history of colonialism. Christianity is implicated, right? In Christianity's kind of colonial legacy. I think that may be, for some people, reason enough not to talk about Christianity in public sphere space at all. But what hasn't been implicated in the Western tradition in colonialism? Have not the great writers been implicated in colonialist project? Read Edward Said on this. Have not great political visions been implicated in colonialist project? Think of Karl Marx. Think of Immanuel Kant in connection with I can run it down through the who's who in Western canon. Certainly, Christianity has been implicated. My sense is that it's Christianity that has been too closely tied to the political power. It's a Christianity that has been too closely allied with the empire. And it's at the heart, I think, of Christian faith, as I think it is at the heart of world faiths, precisely to resist that kind of an implication. I think some people are very leery when great religious faiths think in terms of universal terms, because any form of universalism is already seen as a kind of colonial by default. But I think there is something very salutary in universalism, and what's salutary about it is that religious universalism thematizes human beings qua human beings, which is to say that to each of them it grants exactly the same value. That is to say, that is a foundation then for a basically anti-colonial project that I think would have been more in line with the character of the Christian faith. I think also, notwithstanding the passages from the Old Testament, more in line with the Bible itself.
You mentioned just then, and you did on Q&A last night, that Christianity serves society best from the margins. And one questioner has picked you up on that and said, should we intentionally move there or wait to be pushed?
I think any Christianity that's think of itself at the center of the power has to a significant degree already betrayed itself. So I think wherever one finds oneself, there's kind of marginality in terms of ethical stance, in terms of loyalty, that's already at work in authentic faith. I cannot be at the center of the power, fully identified with the power, and serve the one God of all people. I will always be at a remove. My allegiance will always be conditional. The only allegiance that's not conditional is the allegiance to that one. And therefore certain forms of marginality reside at the very center of power if Christians find themselves there.
That segues to the topic of religious violence. Often religion has at the centre been violent. And one of the questioners asks about the work of William Kavanagh, who's written about the violence of religion, so-called, and the violence of democracy also. What is religion's role in violence, and what is religion's role in calling democratic violence to account?
Yeah, nation state has been, it competes quite well, I think, with religion for violence. I think wins if you do the kind of body counts. One of my friends actually ordered a book called Body Count, and he had a sociologist and historian of societies do the comparative analysis. Which of the religions, including their Marxism, has in its trail left the largest number of dead people? It's a kind of morbid endeavor.
But who wins or loses?
Well, that's an interesting question. In this book, and it's my very good friend who's a Muslim, Prince Ghazi of Jordan, is the one who commissioned that book. Christians win, meaning most bodies are in Christian trail. Now, I'm not completely convinced, but even if we come second, right? Are we going to be particularly proud of that as Christians, or third for that matter, or fourth? The difference might be 50 million up and down. Okay, each individual life matters, but if you've got 90 behind you already, it's so. A nation state, I think, has been deeply implicated in violence. I'm not sure though fully what to think of Kavanagh's work in terms of nation states. I'm partly persuaded by the work of Steven Pinker, whom I have I don't know if you've seen this book. It's a about 800-page tome called Better Angels of Our Nature. And he argues that violence has over the centuries declined. Violence understood at least in kind of relative terms, kind of per capita violent incident in which involve homicide, have over the centuries from primitive societies until today have actually consistently declined. And he thinks that part of the reason is a kind of a much more benign violence of the nation state. Nation state's self-imposition of kind of Leviathan, which controls, has monopoly on violence. It reduces number of homicides, and he thinks that pacification of societies like Europe is part to be attributed to the emergence of nation state. Kavanagh makes exactly opposite argument, and I'm not sure exactly how to adjudicate, though Pinker has a good point, I think.
Someone asks, how ought a Christian politician and or a Muslim politician act in society as a politician?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure that I have very good advice, actually.
Last night on Q&A, you said a politician needs to learn to separate their religion from their politics.
Well, so for instance, you can take, say a judge. You can't make judgments on the basis of your personal convictions. You make judgments according to the laws of the land to a certain extent. I think politician has to do the same thing. And I think one of the central questions is to what degree in a particular setting a person thinks that the kind of political office that they might have would be in sync with the conscience, their own conscience, because politics exert kind of pressures to act in certain ways in accordance with the kind of demands of the political situation, and these are, I think, the wisdom judgments which have to be made. And I think there ought to be a point where politicians can say, "Sorry, I don't do that, even if the state requires. Just like, for instance, I think that, I don't know how it is here, but in the United States, if you serve me, I'm kind of half pacifist or semi-pacifist, not quite fully. So take what I say with that from that perspective. But I could never understand on any grounds, moral grounds, Christian grounds, how it is that a person can be conscripted or himself join or herself join the army, and then by that very act commit himself or herself to wage all the wars which the army to which he has signed, for which he has signed up, wages. That seems abdicating one's own conscience to another institution, and it seems to be complete betrayal of the moral stance that one has. I cannot abdicate my moral responsibility to an army. I cannot abdicate my moral responsibility to a state. That would mean to have a state which is God rather than, or army which is God and not God who is God, right? And in that sense, I think politicians have to make, or those engaged in politics have to make difficult judgments. I may be more severe than some other folks are on this, but that's where I stand about it.
Someone makes the observation that, ironically, it's kind of the majority, powerful, educated type of person that can make your argument here in the public and at Yale. But how are the oppressed, the poor, the minorities who don't really have a voice in the public square to speak up in this pluralistic world?
Yeah, those who have been silenced. Those who don't even know that they can articulate their own vision, those who have internalized so much the state in which they find themselves that they don't even know that there is an alternative way of life, alternative possibility here. I think that's where speaking for somebody, listening to somebody, being with somebody, experiencing life from their vantage point comes in. I think sometimes those who are oppressed can have kind of alternative politics. I'm thinking of my upbringing. I think by all counts you'd consider us as having been oppressed, just that we didn't know that. And maybe that's because of this internalization of the state in which we were. But I think for us then Christian faith functioned as alternative politics. Now, I did my doctoral dissertation on Karl Marx, and I know what some of you are thinking. That's opiate for the people, right? You dream the dreams so that you can kind of stabilize your situation so that you can feel okay in just about what there is. And I'm sure that it sometimes functions this way, but it can also be a kind of imagining of an alternative world, so that when circumstances become such that one can articulate social vision, it gets to be also articulated so that you hold yourself beholden to something larger than your circumstances, and then you're actually able, in a small scale and then large scale, change what it is. And I think this nurturing of hope, no matter what circumstances, is absolutely fundamental.
In light of your thoughts on religion and conflict and violence and the idea of a pluralistic democracy, the importance of that, are we compelled, therefore, to fight for freedom of religion in other countries where this pluralistic democracy doesn't exist? I
think we should fight, which is not necessarily with machine guns, right? Not with bombers or whatever. I think often of 250 million persecuted Christians. That's a lot of folks. Other religions as well. And I think we have some responsibility for them. I think we have responsibility to struggle for concrete human beings, but also for institutions in other countries which would allow them to have a space in which they can breathe freely, articulate their own vision of good life, live that vision of good life to the good of others. Yeah, I think we have a social responsibility. That's part and parcel of loving our neighbors.
A hot topic in Australia at the moment is special religious education in state schools, not the private religious schools. And someone has asked what your ideas of pluralistic democracy might mean for the teaching of religion in schools, with kids in primary school, so under 12-year-olds, and kids in high school.
You know, I think my argument would be kind of equal access. I think each country might have their own traditions, how they might do that, but I think it's impartiality of the state toward all religious and our religious perspectives, and therefore I can imagine religion being taught, but then also other religions than just one particular being taught as well. There are varieties of alternatives are possible here.
But you're not a fan of comparative religion, the sort of supposedly impartial, objective approach to religion? Well,
I think we need information about religions, right? So I'm not opposed to this, but I don't think that's enough. I think what I'm trying to do at Yale is also essential for the well-being of our children, well-being of our society, to stimulate the discussion about what are the alternative ways to what is a pervasive way in which we think that in what flourishing life consists. And I think it consists in basically fulfillment of our desires. And often these desires are relatively reduced to what comes to us from media. And interesting thing that I was not as much aware of it. How, for instance, three phenomena that we study, they're something that everybody, of course, is concerned about, which is sex, money, and power. But all three phenomena in contemporary culture have their own addictions, and very significant addictions. And you see something then in the dynamic of the desire, which creates addictive character if the desire is not framed, trained in proper way. And I think all world faiths seek to shape and train the desire and expand the desire so that it doesn't stay limited to the flat plane of everyday reality and therefore issue in addictions. And I think training in normative dimensions of religious faiths would be important. I think that's also part of the reason for doing evangelism for those of us who are Christians.
Segues beautifully to the question someone has written in. Where does the Great Commission to go out and make disciples of all nations fit into this idea of pluralistic democracy?
Fits really well.
Yes, I agree. Can you articulate that to others?
Now, it seems to me like the definition of pluralistic democracy for me is that each of the alternative accounts of life worth living or of the good life has claim to truth. And therefore, every time I talk about Christian faith, it is implicitly a form of witness. If I talk about Christian faith as true, whether the situation is one of dialogue or the situation is one of proclamation, it is bearing witness. And I think the most fundamental stance of a way of of pursuing or making good on the Great Commission is simply to bear witness. Bearing witness not to myself, bearing witness to something that is outside of myself, something that's larger than myself, and something that I consider to be true. In that sense, I think I expect Muslims to evangelize me. I expect Buddhists to evangelize me, and if they don't, I think, well, why not? Why would you have this that you consider to be true, and I sit here and you're just content to twiddle with your thumbs and won't tell me? Why is it that what should I do with my desires so that I can be liberated? That's a great conversation to have and to go back and forth, and I might be enriched.